Good morning, or morning?
Wow.
It's morning somewhere. Good. Yes, good evening. Have to bear with me. I'm just playing around with using a whiteboard. Obviously, my handwriting isn't the best, but just using it in a class, I have to learn to do that. So I decided, well, I have the opportunity, and today I have the opportunity because Mel had an allergic reaction. I ended up having to run to go get a prescription for her, which was turned into a bit of a fiasco. And so I didn't get all my slides together. So I thought, hey, good opportunity to mess around with using a whiteboard. Plus, it's just, I need to think, I would like to integrate that into my teaching style anyway. So thank you for bearing with me on that as I experiment a little bit. We're in Job chapter 32. And at this point in Job, it'll shift a little bit. We basically had the discourses with Job were revealing in the sense that we got to see what happened to Job, the impact on him, his missing, feeling like God was missing in his life as he was going through a hard time. He spent so much time culturing a relationship with him, and in the prologue of the book, it tells you how important it was for Job to have a right relationship with God, and you see him lose that. But he also lost his work. He lost his family, his friends, his employees, if you will, their servants. But all of that was lost to him, and he suffered greatly for it. And but it didn't stop there, because here you get some insights into how his community looked at him. And they changed their disposition towards him, where they were considering him an honorable man, where just by watching what happened, you see that shift a little bit. And his friends come to comfort him. But instead of getting comfort from his friends, he got false accusations and foolish arguments. And that's what's been going on, is Job has been trying to say, look, I am not guilty of anything. God just did this to me. And they're trying to say, when God does this, it's because you're guilty. And it's been hurtful to Job, and you see kind of this back and forth. It's Job basically versus his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And they started out gentle, but really just got harsh pretty quickly. And one of the things they did, which was the challenge, is they stated, here's my position. And when Job pushed back, instead of listening, they defended their position. So a lot of the discourse has to do with Job saying, that doesn't seem right, and here's how I know that's not right. And his friends saying, here's why I'm right. And really there's a lot of that going on. So at the end of this discourse, we have Job make his longest speech, and essentially he corrects his friends for their error. He says, he basically put on his teacher hat. Even though he's in all this torment and pain, he put on the hat of a mentor, a teacher. He instructs them. And then he says, and I am innocent, I have not lived wrong. And he goes through a whole list of righteous things to do. In fact, I didn't mention it last week, but I think it was either 30 or 31, where Job just talks about being a good man, and describing, here's what I've done, here's what it's like, I haven't neglected the widows and the orphan. They've ate from my table. They wore my sheep's wool to stay warm. The widows have praised me because I took care of them, and I've taken them into my family. And he just described what a good man does. And the thing that crossed my mind on that is that's practical application of the qualifications of being an elder, right? Just how Job describes himself. That's what an elder does, right? Is they're just good men. They live good lives. They they engage and help the people in the community around them, and that's just what they do. And really, that was just a thought I had as I was reading through it. But it's just one of those things. Job was a very good man. And he even had not like an elder in the church, but it was, in ways it's similar. He was an elder, and he sat in the gate of the city, and he instructed the city with wisdom and judgment and instruction. He did all that for his city and his region. And so he defends himself. And his friends don't answer. So during this whole time, there's this guy, and I always imagine him being about 40, not a young man, but not an old man, not in the ranks of Job and his friends, but old enough to have lived some life and gained some knowledge and able to answer and feel confident. Look, I can give an answer here. And so Elihu speaks up. Here in Job chapter 32. But I just want to begin here. We'll read these first couple of verses and note what their conclusions about Job were. Then these three men ceased answering Job. This is Job 32, verse 1. Then these three men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. So here his friends, they wouldn't even answer him anymore, because he was righteous in his own eyes. We can't argue with you. We can't. What are we going to do? If someone thinks they're right, they're just blinded to the truth. We're not even going to answer anymore. So they just ceased answering him. So now you see how Job's friends respond in the end. Throw up hands. Miserable comforters is what Job called them. And I think that is a fair representation of what they were. In verse 2 now, we have Elihu. And it says he gets angry. And it's kind of an interesting thing, is this whole beginning of this is all about Elihu's anger. And you got to imagine, what would it be like for you if you were sitting, I'll tell you exactly what this would be like. Have you ever watched a political debate? And you're sitting there listening to someone you disagree with, but you can't say anything, but you feel like you want to say something. And sometimes, do you talk to your TV? Like, no one hears you. But you say something anyway. Like, it's that sort of a thing where if whatever it is, something like that, or if you're like watching a show and you know the answer, and you're sitting there and you like start yelling the answer like it's going to help somehow, but because you know. This is basically how Elihu felt. He's been sitting there. He's been listening to the discourses. He's been soaking it in, following the reason and the arguments, thinking, I could do this better. These guys can't even support their own arguments. These guys don't even know what they're talking about. And so that's what's going through his head, and that's what he's basically going to say here in a minute. But that's what's going through his head as he's watching this. But he knows, in their culture, you always deferred to the wisdom of the elders. So he's young enough to not put himself in the same class as these four older men. So he's sitting, listening, receiving instruction. And one of the interesting things you'll see is as we go through Elihu's discourse, he's going to quote, here's what you said. And here are the statements you made. Now, I'm going to answer that. But he doesn't say it exactly, and which is actually, I think, better listening when you can hear it and then restate it in your own words, and restate what they said accurately, but in your own way. That's good listening because you've processed it, you've absorbed it, and now you can respond to it. So he's been considerate, but he's also feeling a little bit agitated, and that's really how we're going to begin with this. Look here in Job 32, verse 2. The anger of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned against Job. His anger burned because he justified himself before God. And his anger burned against his three friends because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. So here is his two problems. Job said, I'm right and God's wrong. And Elihu got angry about that. But the friends, they made all these accusations. And he's like, you don't have a scrap of evidence to say that. And so it's kind of interesting where Elihu kind of sits where we sit. And really, this has been kind of our discussion all along the way, is we're looking at Job and how he suffered and those things. We're considering the impact on him and what the friends are doing and the impact of how we should respond. We're considering all those things. But ultimately, we're looking at Job's friends and saying, you can't even support your position. You're just saying it without support. You're asserting something without being able to state the facts that lead you to believe that assertion. That's something that is to be careful. And Elihu says, that's ridiculous. Don't do that. So he's defending Job in that statement. But then, where Job went wrong, Elihu he's tracking on that too. You have no right to speak out against God. You will never be able to defend yourself. And what he says is, God doesn't have to answer to you, Job. Why would you make a case before him? What makes you think that God has any reason to listen to you? He acts, and it's right. That's how Elihu's thinking. So really, I think we're kind of in Elihu's camp as far as listening to the argument and the way we want to shout back at the TV screen, if you will, to respond to these guys. And maybe we've done it a little bit. And that's kind of where Elihu sits. Now, Elihu also has some problematic assumptions. But they're actually pretty much, I like what Elihu says. Now, there's a few things that he assumes, and it's from a lack of understanding. And in a lot of ways, he's in the same spot where Job is. Where Job is right mostly, except for there's a few things he assumes that are wrong. And Elihu assumes the same things. Job has always assumed that God is punishing him without cause. Now, the assumption it's a punishment is false. This is not a punishment. This is just really, it's a demonstration. It's a weightlifting competition, if you will, to see what does true faith in God look like. And God is demonstrating that for the future generations, because God was thinking about us when he did this. But he also was demonstrating it for heavenly beings, showing here is what a righteous man looks like. Here's what a righteous man does. And that's really what God is doing in all this. So Job's assumption that this is a punishment was a wrong assumption. And so it led him to say a few things that were inaccurate. Elihu is making that same assumption that this is a punishment, and it leads him to conclude a few things that are inaccurate. But overall, his reasoning, I think, is a lot more sound. Here's just kind of an interesting thing about who Elihu is. We don't know for certain. So I'll just lead with that up front. People have speculated to some extent because he is. So Job is. In fact, let's just go ahead and read this real quick. It's in Genesis. Let me find on my note here. Genesis 22. And verse 20. So Genesis 22, verse 20. Now it came about after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, and Buz his brother, and Kemuel and the father of Aram. So here you just see that Abraham's nephews, Uz and Buz. Now do you remember the land which Job lived in? The land of Uz. And here's Elihu, and he is a Buzite, son of Buz. So there is a likely familiar connection to Abraham in this, and Elihu's name is a Semitic name. Eli is the Hebrew word for God. So he may have been some of the things they say that his argument style, I don't know, I don't put much credence in argument style positions, but they say it's more of an Arabic poetic style versus a Hebrew poetic style. But either way, from that eastern region, a descendant of Abraham, so from a similar Semitic family although a little ways down the line, maybe a couple generations down. So so we don't know that for certain, but that is probably the most likely family connection right here. So Eli is likely distantly related to the Israel and that nation over there. So Elihu begins burning in his anger, and he begins to answer. In chapter 32, verse 4, it says, "Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were years older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his anger burned. So Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, spoke and said, 'I am young in years, and you are old. Therefore I was shy and afraid to tell you what I think. I thought age should speak, and increased years should teach wisdom. But it is the spirit of a man, and the breath of the Almighty gives them understanding.'" So here he begins by saying, "I yielded to you because I expected you to bring forth wisdom." That's our expectation, is the older people will be wise because they have years of experience and understanding and figuring out how to live life and how to do things successfully. That's what wisdom is you take information and you figure out how to apply it effectively. One of the ways I think of wisdom is a kind of an easy way for me to understand, at least, is it's one thing buying a bunch of tools and cutting wood and trying to make stuff. It's another thing working with a craftsman who had been doing it for 30, 40 years and having them show you how to make stuff. What's the difference between the guy who is starting, just bought some tools, I'm going to go make something in my garage, and the guy who's been doing it for 30, 40 years?
Lack of knowledge.
Well, there's a lack of knowledge, but the thing that I would say defines a craftsman, he knows what's going to happen before he does it. Right? He knows all the mistakes you get into when you're doing that particular craftsmanship. So you can say, okay, here's how you avoid this problem. Here's how you avoid this problem. If you do that, you're going to cut your hand. If you do this, this is counterintuitive, but if you do it this way, it'll actually work together better because of this, this, and this. So you start going through, and a craftsman knows how to get the result he wants the best possible way. So you have the same basic tools and the same basic materials and the same basic knowledge, but the application of that knowledge and understanding how things will work in the end is where what distinguishes a craftsman. And that's what wisdom is. It's being able to take understanding and use it effectively to get the result you want. So in this case, it's not craftsmanship with physical materials, although there's a form of wisdom in that. It's craftsmanship with how to do things according to God, how to determine how to get the right results with your life. In this case, how to correct a man who is sinful and being punished by God. So Elihu expected them to have some insights on how am I going to do that. But here, it turns out, they didn't have it. So he says, I waited for you guys because I expected you to have wisdom. However, wisdom doesn't come from the spirit of a man. Wisdom comes from God. Ultimately, that's where true wisdom lies. And that's one of the cases Job made, actually. In a lot of places, Elihu repeats Job. He'll repeat some of the friends too, but primarily he'll repeat Job and in a good way. Like here, Job said, wisdom is to turn away from evil, and wisdom is to know God, and understanding is to turn away from evil. Job says that, and that's basically what Elihu admits here. Almighty gives them understanding. Verse 9, the abundant in years may not be wise, nor may elders understand justice. So I say, listen to me. I too will tell you what I think. Behold, I waited for your words. I listened to your reasonings while you pondered what to say. I even paid close attention to you. Indeed, there was no one who refuted Job. Not one of you answered his words. Do not say we have found wisdom. God will rout him, not man. So here he's saying, no one could answer Job, and don't try and claim that you're wise. He's like, it isn't man who's going to, in the end, judge Job. It's God. And so they couldn't even answer from man's perspective. So he's like, but Job's arguments won't stand before God just because you can't answer them. So we need to argue from the right, and that's kind of what he's getting at here. I want to jump forward here to verse 18, and I think this is a pretty good statement that he makes. He says, "For I am full of words, the spirit within me constrains me." And he's not wrong. He is full of words. This whole first chapter is just him saying, I'm going to say something. He says it like 8 different ways, actually. I'm going to say something to you guys.
Any minute now.
I'm warming up. And probably what he's doing is he's actually seeking permission to say something, because what he's doing is out of line from a cultural or respect perspective. He's stepping out of his lane a little bit, and I think he is just seeking permission to speak frankly among this older generation. So, and really that's what I think he's working on, and that's, someone had commented on that. I think that's fairly a fair point. He's being diplomatic in getting up his words and beginning to speak. So he's just showing due respect, because he's going to speak frankly. Look in verse 20. Let me speak that I may get relief. Let me open my lips and answer. Let me now be partial to no one, nor flatter any man. For I do not know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. So here you get a brief glimpse of Elihu's attitude towards and disposition towards God. God is my Maker, and he makes that claim that I'm made out of clay like you guys. I have a right to speak like you guys have a right to speak. I have a spirit given by God within me that can have wisdom just the same as you have a spirit given by God. So he's just saying it's not out of line here. But then he says, I am not going to be partial, and I'm not going to flatter you. I am not. So what they did with Job, so there's one thing you can do where you can try and really speak in a way that's going to appeal to somebody, even if you're softening what you're saying or changing what you're saying to match someone's sensibility. You know, you guys are really wise, but what do you think about this? He's like, I'm not going to do that. There's another way that flattery can go, is exaggerating in the negative. And this is what Job's friends did to him. It's not technically flattery, but it's the same sort of thing where they're overemphasizing something in order to make their point. So one is overemphasizing in compliments, one's overemphasizing in insults, and he says, I'm not going to be doing any of that. I'm going to be frank and say the truth simply. But he needs permission for that, because it could be viewed as disrespectful if someone's just frank and says this truth without garnishing it or embellishing it in a way to make it more pleasant. So that's how he basically says, I'm just going to tell you what I think. We're just going to be straightforward with it. Any thoughts or comments so far? All right, so in 33, he begins his speech to Job, and sorry, I can't quite read my writing. It's still small. Okay, 1 through 5, what Elihu basically claims is what I believe what I'm saying is true and right. So he's not just speaking words to win an argument or to make a point or to look good. He's like, I'm going to tell you what I think is right. In verse 3 it says, my words are from the uprightness of my heart, and my lips speak knowledge sincerely. So he's just saying, what I'm telling you, this is truly what I believe is right. I'm convinced of it, and I'm just telling you what I think. This is a great example. And it's also 2 good examples. Young people have a place to contribute in a congregation or in whatever group they're in. They have a place to contribute. What they have, their insights, their energy, their sometimes they think outside the box from what you're used to seeing all the time. And so having some young people who are like Elihu, where they listen and they consider and they pay attention when they need to, but they also say, hey, may I contribute some feedback into this? There might be a better way to do this. That is just a great quality. And so for us, we have a lot of young people in this congregation, but sometimes, the ideas of young people are going to make a major difference. So being able to say it in a respectful way, but also being able to say it just in a sincere way, this is what I believe. And what he also says, correct me if I'm wrong. This is what I believe, but correct me if I'm wrong. And he has a good attitude. Listening, respect, and also thoughtfulness. And all these things Elihu has.
Paul's instruction to Timothy, the young preacher, was along these same lines. He said, let no one disregard or disrespect your youth, but at the same time adhere to the principles that you've been taught through the Spirit, and teach the folks what they need to know. And who can argue with it? If the person, regardless of their age or how young they are, if they're speaking the truth, you have to go a long ways to argue with that, because then you're arguing against the word. If it's properly spoken.
Yeah, and also he's anticipating a little pride response, and he's communicating, I mean no disrespect. So yeah, but that's a wonderful point. And really what you said, that he gives Timothy a whole list of instructions about being respectful, treat older men as fathers, older women as mothers, be diligent to prove yourself in everything you're doing so that no one can, that's what a great point, what a great insight. Julie, do you have a thought?
And God does not rebuke Elihu, right? So as we're reading this, most of it is good stuff, unlike his friends who God did rebuke.
Yeah, and so that's the other thing is what Elihu says just stands there. Right? It's not answered. It's just, here's something this guy said, here's what God said. And so there's no refute. Job doesn't refute either. He listens to it, and maybe he gets what he was looking for from Elihu. So yeah, that's a great point. That's a great insight as well. So let's go ahead and begin now in 33, 6 through 11. He's going to basically say, I'm going to address what you said, Job. And really that's where he starts. He just digs right in. So chapter 33, starting in verse 6. Behold, I belong to God like you. I too have been formed out of clay. Behold, no fear of me should terrify you, nor should my pressure weigh heavily on you. Surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words. I am pure without, and I have heard the sound of your words. So here's the beginning is, don't let me be threatening to you, and you know I don't have a lot of weight to throw around. All I'm going to do is say the truth. I'm going to address what you've said, and I've heard what you said. So he says, I've heard the sound of your words. And then the next thing he says after that is what Job said. Look here with me in verse 9. I am pure without transgression. I am innocent, and there is no guilt in me. This is something Job said. In fact, what he's addressing here, if you'll look with me into Job chapter 13, he addresses pretty much in order here what Job says in chapter 13. So Job 13:23, he says, how many are my iniquities? Make known to me my rebellion and sin. Why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy? Will you cause a driven leaf to tremble? Will you pursue the dry chaff? For you write bitter things against me and make me to inherit the iniquities of my youth. You put my feet in stocks and watch all my paths. You set a limit for the soles of my feet, while I am decaying like a rotting thing, like a garment that is moth-eaten. So here's Job complaining to God about, I'm innocent, but you just stop looking at me. And this is where Job says, just stop looking at me so I can die in peace. Stop following my path. Aren't you a God? Don't you have something better to do than to put all your attention on me? So that was Job's argument in this. And note what Elihu says now in chapter 32, starting in verse 9. He says, I am pure without transgression. I am innocent, and there is no guilt in me. Behold, he invents a pretext against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks, and he watches my paths. Behold, I've been listening to you. And then he goes through and says, here's what you said. In verse 12, then he answers, behold, let me tell you, you are not right in this, for God is greater than man. So here he's making an accusation against God and saying, what are you doing this to me for? I'm innocent. And Elihu says, Job, it wasn't right for you to say that. He's like, God doesn't answer to you, you answer to God. And so he says, for God is greater than man. You shouldn't have said that. And then he goes on, verse 13. Why do you complain against him, that he does not give an account of all his doings? Isn't the question just enough? Why are you complaining God isn't giving an account of what he's doing to you?
God doesn't answer to you.
Yeah. Why do you need to know? Right? And so as a young man who's very respectful in getting into this conversation, and then, he's because they don't need to listen to him. And it's just two older men to a younger man. Now there's an old man to God. God doesn't need to give you an answer, Job. That's from what I understand. He doesn't need to give you reports. He's not accountable to you. And Elihu's right. He's right to tell Job this was the wrong thing to do. So he says, why do you complain against him that he does not give an account of all his doings? Indeed, God speaks once or twice, yet no one notices it. In a dream, a vision of the night, when sound asleep falls on men, while they slumber in their beds, then he opens the ears of men and seals their instruction, that he may turn man aside from his conduct and keep man from his pride. So I want to just say here he's saying the most God will do to give you an account is maybe he'll give you a dream or two. And maybe you'll notice, maybe you won't. There's a few examples, just this sort of thing. I don't know if it's exactly what he's talking about, but you remember the king in the Pharaoh and Joseph, and the king had this dream of the fat cows and skinny cows, the fat stalks and the skinny stalks, and Joseph gives the interpretation. And he's like, now you had the dream twice, which means it's been determined and it's going to happen quickly, so we need to take action on this, right? He got two dreams. Hey, that's certain then, right? So that's basically that's what Elihu's saying. If he's going to give an account to you, that's what it's going to look like, and maybe you won't notice, maybe you won't. But that doesn't mean. But he doesn't owe you that. The reason he might do that is to turn you back onto the right path. And so the next thing he's going to say, starting at 17, is where he gets to the idea of correction. He brings it in good. And in fact, from our perspective, Elihu is pretty much on point as far as responding to God's discipline. He is right in the way he's saying God works in our lives to draw us back to him. That's one of the things that we've talked about on and off throughout this class is the difference between this retribution thing and then the discipline of the Lord. And what does the discipline of the Lord look like? Because we're all disciplined by the Lord. God, in Hebrews it says, a loving father disciplines his sons. And since God loves you, you can expect him to work in your life, maybe in uncomfortable ways sometimes, to draw you away from the pit, as he puts it here, and into the light of life. And God works in our lives to do that in various ways. And so Elihu says you can expect that, to see that. So look here in 17. Here's the first call, is that he may turn you aside from his conduct and keep man from his pride. So here's the first one, is God works in your life in the negative to pull you back from pride. If we verse. So in 18 then, he says, he keeps back his soul from the pit and his life from passing over into Sheol. Man is also chastened with pain on his bed and unceasing complaint in his bones, so that his life loathes all bread and his food and his soul favorite food. His flesh wastes away from sight, and his bones, which were not seen, stick out. Then his soul draws near to the pit, and his life to those who bring death. If there is an angel as a mediator for him, 1 out of 1,000, to remind a man what is right for him, then let him be gracious to him and say, deliver him from going down to the pit, I have found a ransom. Let his flesh and bone be fresher than his youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then he will pray to God, and he will accept him, that he may see his face with joy, and he may restore his righteousness to man. And he will sing and say, I have sinned and have perverted what is right, and it is not proper for me. He has redeemed my soul from going to the pit, and my life shall see the light. Behold, God does all these things oftentimes with men, to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. So here he makes the case 3 times. He says that in 17, to cause man to turn back from pride. In 19, to chasten a man. He gives him extreme discomfort, really describes Job's situation, gives him that description. And then he brings up this idea of a mediator, which, if you'll recall, what did Job say he wanted between him and God?
A referee.
Referee, a mediator, right? And so here Elihu's bringing up Job, hey, sometimes God gets you close to the pit so he can send a referee to pull you away from the pit. No, 1 in 1,000, and maybe the best, it says an angel, but maybe the best understanding would be a prophet. Like, for instance, when David sinned with Bathsheba, God sent Nathan to pull him away from the pit. You're the man. So that would be probably the idea here, not necessarily an angelic being. Of course, it could be that as well, but just someone to go, and maybe Elihu is pointing to himself in this case, saying someone needs to come and tell this guy to turn back. Now, in saying this, though, what's the assumption?
That he needs to turn back.
That he needs to turn back. And I guess the other assumption might be, is God saving, like maybe you were going to do something in the future and God's kind of getting you out of that before it happens. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but he's at least he's saying, look, something needs to change. Now here you have Job, and the thing he's correcting Job for, that Job did, was being prideful. Right? Why are you giving all your attention to me, calling God into question? That is a prideful thing to do, even if he's doing it out of pain. It wasn't right for him to do, and Elihu's right. God doesn't answer to you, and God doesn't answer to Job. He never does. But that's what you're seeing here is Elihu's actually being practical in his application. But it's almost like retroactively applying things, because the problems happened, and then Job did some things, but he didn't do some things, and that's why there was a problem. And maybe he's saying, God put this in your life to expose your problems. But that's kind of the ideas that seem to connect with this. So in 30. And here's the thing: to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. I just think this is an interesting thing. I heard an old story. I probably have used it here preaching before, but this family, and they had a bunch of kids, and they felt their house was too crowded. I think it was a Jewish family. So they go to their rabbi, and they say, we don't have a big enough house, we have too many kids, what do we do? And the rabbi says, well, go ahead and bring the goats into the house. So they go back home, they bring the goats into the house, and then they go back. It's worse than ever. It's bring the sheep into the house. They bring the sheep into the house. He goes back. We can hardly live now. We thought it was bad. Now it's bad. He's like, okay, now bring the chickens into the house. So they got all the goats, the sheep, the chickens, and finally the mule or the donkey. And then they go to the rabbi. This is not working. He's like, okay, then take the animals out of the house. They go back to the rabbi later, and they say, man, well, our house feels roomy. So and maybe that's the idea here, right? Is you got next to the pit in the darkness, so when you step out of the darkness, the light is so much brighter. You really get to see the good in things. I don't think Elihu's wrong on this idea either. Sometimes adversity really helps us to appreciate what we have. Just another illustration on that, just something I read the other day. I'd shared this with you about a man in Florida. He was one of the presenting preachers at our seminar I went to. He had lost a son, and he had talked about that. Well, just recently I saw him post on Facebook a picture of this tree, and he's like, I planted this tree when my son died. And he was saying, that was really hard, but if I could go back and do it again, I wouldn't kill this tree to get my son back, because my treasure is not on this earth. And the joy, the hope of the joy of heaven is my joy and not my children. He's like, I'll know my son one day, but I would rather have what God gave me than try and look back or try and hold to what I have on this earth. And I thought that was a lot more meaningful for someone who went through that kind of an adversity and can look and see. And something he said at the seminar was, the reality is, because of my sin, I didn't deserve any of that time I had with my son. He's like, I didn't deserve it. I don't deserve the good things I have in my life right now. It's only because God is good that I have them, because I have, on my own, completely alienated myself from God. If I have anything good, it's only because God is gracious to me. I don't deserve it. But in adversity like that, you maybe do see the light of life a little bit different. And maybe that's what Elihu's getting at here. But I think that's a great thought either way, just an encouraging thought. And sometimes, in our own lives, we go through adversity, but then there's a hope in knowing, look, if I make it through this, I'm going to be able to see the good of life in a different way that I maybe couldn't have seen it before. So 31, this is chapter 33, verse 31. Pay attention, O Job, listen to me, keep silent and let me speak. Then if you have anything to answer me, speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me, keep silent, and I will teach you wisdom. So here he says, I desire to justify you, not to find a way to make you right, but to help you be right. So I desire to see you in the right. So that's why I'm saying this. And this is really a completely different attitude than Job's friends. They wish to condemn him. Elihu wants to call him to righteousness, call him to rightness, and justify, help him stand in a right position in a relationship with God. Any thoughts or comments with that before we move forward?
His motivation, his mindset seems to be much more honest than the first three so-called friends. I mean, they were out to prove a point, and it was their position that they were trying to force on Job. Elihu is, even as a younger man, he just seems to be a lot more honest in what he's putting across here.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And he's doing what Job needed.
Correct.
He is pushing back in a reasoned and wise way against Job's complaints, so Job can look at something from a better perspective. Because he's in a spot where he doesn't have a clear perspective, but Elihu does. Yeah, so I think you're right on with that, where he's doing the friend thing. He's doing what the other friends should have been doing. So in 34, 1 through 9, he brings up some more things Job says. So let's go ahead and read this, and you'll recognize as we go through this some of the things that we've heard Job said and discussed coming up again. Elihu continued and said, "Hear my words, you wise men, and listen to me, you who know. For the ear tests the words as the palate tastes food. Let us choose for ourselves what is right. Let us know among ourselves what is good." So here, does that sound familiar to you? For the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Now Job says that same thing, and he's like, I know things too. You don't know more than me. That was his argument, but that's how he started. I think this was in chapter 12, verse 11, where Job says that. But he's like, I know things too. The ear tests wisdom as the tongue tastes food. So that's kind of Job's words being turned back on to Job. And Elihu saying that's what we're doing here. And then in verse 5, he says, For Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my right. Should I lie concerning my right? My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. So that's... and then he goes on to say, he's quoting Eliphaz here in verse 7. What man is like Job, who drinks up derision like water? Do you remember Eliphaz when he said that to Job? He drinks iniquity like water, is how he says it. You're just full of sin. So here Job, on one hand, is saying, God has taken away my right, and he's wounded me incurably without transgression. So that's Job's accusation. And then here's Eliphaz's accusation, is this man drinks up iniquity like water. He's like, and it's almost like you're accusing God falsely, he's accusing you falsely, but that's what's going on here. That's what you guys are doing. I'll go on, starting in verse 8. Here's more of the accusations against Job. Who goes in company with the workers of iniquity and walks with wicked men? For he has said, it profits man nothing when he is pleased with God. So there's Job's response. Is he's like, these guys are accusing you of being iniquity workers. You're accusing God of being wrong. Job says, what profit is it to be pleasing to God if this is how he repays faithfulness? So all of these are false accusations, harsh things to say. And Eliphaz then in verse 10, therefore listen to me, you men of understanding. Here again you have that kind of sarcastic tone coming on, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do wickedness, and from the Almighty to do wrong. So here he's just beginning. God doesn't do wrong, guys. Did you forget about that? Job's accusing him of doing wrong. All these things going on, and he's like, God's not mistaken. God is not sinning. He's not doing wrong. And then he goes on to say, well, why isn't God doing wrong? And this is actually a great answer for that, for how he's talking about it. Far be it from God to do wickedness, from the Almighty to do wrong. For he pays a man according to his work, and makes him find it according to his way. Surely God will not act wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. Who gave him authority over the earth? And who has laid on him the whole earth? If he should determine to do so, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. But if you have understanding, hear this. Okay, so we'll stop right there. Here's his question. God won't ever do anything wrong. And then he says, 13. Who gave him authority over the earth? Who's the guy that God answers to? What moral authority is God under? None, right? God can do whatever he wants, and it by definition it can't be wrong because he's God. Now God doesn't act contrary to who he is. And you know, so there's things that people say, well, like God can't tell a lie. Why can't God tell a lie?
He's totally righteous.
And he's omnipotent, right? A lie is something you do from a position of weakness. It's always from a position of weakness, right? I don't want you to know. I don't want you to find out. I don't want you to think this way. Like you're trying to control what someone else says through underhandedness instead of directness. What can anyone do to God? Why would he ever have to misrepresent himself? He's not weak at all. He's omnipotent. If he lied, that wouldn't be true. Because a lie is a form of, it's a weakness. It's from a position of weakness. So anyway, that's his question. Who gave God authority? If God, and this is what he says, if God decided, I want my spirit back, and just took it, sucked it all back in, what would happen? Everybody would die. Because God put his spirit in all of us. That's an interesting thought. Like, he gave us of himself. So part of, and the way Elihu is talking about it is, part of God is invested in every living person, every living thing. If he wanted it back, he could take it, rightly so, and there's nothing we could do about it to stop it. And there's no one who could say, hey, that's wrong. Because it belongs to him. And the point is, it all belongs to him. He can do what he wants. And so just to accuse him of being wrong and to pervert justice is not even logically tenable. This is a pretty smart philosophical argument that Elihu lays out here. If you think about it, if you think what he's saying, it's a pretty sharp argument, and you can't answer it. Like, this is the kind of thing. You can't answer this argument. It's true. You guys are all there's all this, you guys are messing up. God's not messing up. Did you forget about that? And so, verse 16. But if you have understanding, hear this. Listen to the sound of my words. Shall one who hates justice rule? And will you condemn the righteous mighty one? Are you going to be the guy who does it? So Job is accusing God of injustice, which is wrong. His buddies are accusing Job unjustly. And then his question is, do you think you guys are going to be one of the guys who correct God? Do you really think that? Will the unrighteous rule? You guys have been proven wrong. In some of the things you say, you've been proven wrong. And it was easy to do. Do you think you're the one who's going to stand up and answer God? And then notice how he describes God here. Will you condemn the righteous, mighty one who says to a king, worthless one, to nobles, wicked ones, who shows no partiality to princes, nor regards the rich above the poor? For they are all the work of his hands. In a moment they die, and at midnight people are shaken and pass away, and the mighty are taken away without a hand. For his eyes are upon the ways of man, and he sees all his... so we'll stop right there. So I think 21 is another quote of Job. So this is first thing is, God is not impressed with the strength of man. You could take the mightiest guy, and he will die in the middle of the night, and no one will even touch him. That's how powerful God is compared to the mightiest guy. Are you really the one who wants to go tell him that? It's just kind of an ironic statement, but no, you know what? I don't want to be the one who do that. So that's kind of what you see going on here. In 21, for his eyes are upon the ways of man, and he sees all his steps. There is no shadow, this is not a quote of Job, this is just a continuation. There is no darkness or deep shadow where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves. For he does not need to consider a man further than that he should go before God in judgment. Here's the next point he's making is, God already knows. And he makes his decision. And there's no debate. He knows everything. He knows the things hidden in the shadow, and when he makes a decision, he makes a decision. There's no appeal process. That's what Job wants, right? I want an appeal. There's no appeal process, because God's never wrong. He's never wrong. He already knows. He doesn't need your permission. There's no, so he's just saying, think about what you're saying. Think about what you're asking. Verse 24. He breaks into pieces mighty men without inquiry and sets others in their place. Therefore he knows their work, and he overthrows them in the night, and they are crushed. He strikes them like the wicked in a public place, because they turned aside from following him and had no regard for any of his ways, so that they caused the cry of the poor to come to him, and that he might hear the cry of the afflicted. When he keeps quiet, who can condemn? And when he hides his face, who then can behold him? That is, in regard to both nation and men, so that the godless men would not rule, nor be snares of the people. For has anyone said to God, I have borne chastisement, I will not offend anymore? Teach me what I do not see. If I have done iniquity, I will not do it again. So here he's saying that God is the final word, and if he acts, no one can stop him, it's right. If he decides not to act, that's also fine. Because what's been the whole argument here between Job and his friends? They're saying the righteous always suffer. And Job's counter-argument is, or the wicked always suffer. Job's counter-argument is, then why don't I see the wicked suffer? Why can you, in every city, go find the wicked guy, and everybody's like catering to him and seeing to his needs because he's got money? Like, why is that happening? And why is he dying and his children going on? And if they suffer, what does he care? So there's all this argument of, is God staying his hand right? Is he acting and that's right? Does God always strike down the wicked? Does he sometimes, like, what does he do? And what Elihu says, if God acts, it's right. If God doesn't act, it's right. It's not up to us to determine that. We need to accept what God has done. And really, he's getting close. He's really hitting close to the truth. Really, the implication of Job's guilt is really the only thing that he's getting wrong, because Job was not guilty. But what he's saying about God is not wrong. I think from human experience, this is I think reasonable, and also it lines up with a lot of what the Scripture says. Let me look at my notes real quick. I want to jump forward to verse 35 here. It says, Job speaks without knowledge, and his words are without wisdom. Job ought to be tried to the limit. Oh, yeah, I want to back up. Here's starting in verse 33. Shall he recompense on your terms because... Oh, yeah, here's the question. Shall he recompense on your terms because you have rejected it? So our job is to be corrected by God and say, how do I do better? What he's asking Job is, do you think God has an obligation to do it the way you like it? So do you have the right to question him if you've rejected his form of punishment for you, Job? He says, shall he recompense on your terms because you have rejected it? For you must not choose, and not I. Therefore declare what you know. Men of understanding will say to me, and a wise man who hears me, Job speaks without... so he's like, wise men would also say, Job speaks without knowledge, and his words are without wisdom. Job ought to be tried to the limit, because he answers like wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin, and he claps his hands among us, and multiplies his words against God. So here, essentially what Elihu was saying is he was good, now all of a sudden he's making the accusation. And so the assumption is, God is acting to correct Job's some form of iniquity. That's the assumption. And when Job responds the way he is, by resisting the discipline. And so he's not saying retribution. He's saying discipline. So the Lord is disciplining Job, trying to refine him and remove some form of iniquity. He's not saying what it is, but he's saying this is reasonable to say God is disciplining you, and you need to accept the discipline of God and try and do better. So it's a more reasonable response. Still assumes fault, which we know Job didn't have fault on that level, to gain this sort of a thing. And he's saying, but as you're being disciplined, your poor character is being exposed as well. And you're acting like wicked men who, when God punishes them, you just sin all the more. He's like, you're being like a wicked man. That's what they do, right? They set their face against, or set their jaw against God, or whatever you would say. They see God's punishment and determine to do it all the more, because I'm not going to give in to his will. And that's what he's accusing Job of. He's saying, when you were disciplined by God, you rebelled against him. So what I'm seeing is your rebellion on top of God's discipline. Now his discipline wasn't to strike you down or to kill you, it was to correct you and get you on the right path. But you're not accepting correction. And I would say that's probably a fair statement, but Job was righteous. We know that. This was not about a discipline thing. This was really about a demonstration of what faithfulness looks like to everybody. And so this is, Job is right in not understanding. But Elihu is saying the way you're pushing back is wrong to do. And so that is, I think I think this is a fair correction, even if the underlying assumption of Job having some faults is not accurate. But even still, I think what he's doing is fair and not hurtful. It's just. I think this is a just approach. He's not looking to make an accusation against Job. He's just saying when God disciplines us, we shouldn't resist it because we don't understand it or because we don't like it. So, what are your thoughts on that? All right. Well, we're out of time. If we don't have any thoughts, then let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer.